Hello. Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader and Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd Edition marked dramatic inflection points in the history of the wargaming hobby. It wasn't just that they were full of iconic art and incredible world building, they were also designed in such a way that there would be a lasting impact. My guest today was the graphic designer responsible for those books, as well as other classic early Citadel titles like Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and White Dwarf magazine as well. And whilst he was at Games Workshop, he also tried his hand at sculpting and was responsible for the creation of the lost classic race, the Chaos Snakemen. In a career across the gaming industry that has seen him responsible for Magic the Gathering development and dusting off the Chainmail license for Wizards of the Coast, my guest has been involved in an enormous number of incredible projects. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Chaz Elliott. Chaz, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it, and I wanted to maybe start by just sort of getting a sense of how you got started in the tabletop industry. Where did you sort of get your first job and your sort of first access to that world, I suppose?
It was actually a scout camping trip to Oxford, and we were allowed into the actual city centre. And I went into a game store at that point in time, and I saw a spinner of Ralpartha miniatures of Tom Myers orcs, I think they were. And at that point in time, I just pocket money, yes, thanks, and bought them, and was into the miniatures. I think primarily as the first vehicle. And then we actually moved. My father was in the Royal Air Force, and so we moved and were stationed in Hendon in London. So at the age of 11, I'd be tripping into the centre of London, going to Darkly Were and Golden Eye, the comic book store, and just having far too much fun. So when Games Workshop in Dowling Road opened up, I was a frequent visitor. To the degree that I think it became more annoying than anything else. At the time, trying to remember the managers. It was one of the Olsen twins who was actually managing the shop at that point in time. And I started painting for him and painting for the display case, putting in, I think, Collector's Series Tom Meyer Ralpartha Elves were the first that I went in there. This is in the days of Humbrol and not licking your paintbrush for fear of going blind. So it was great, and we had far too much fun with new games coming in, and we go in every Saturday. We'd be there as regulars, playing. Remember when Ace of Aces first came out and it launched in the shop, and we were running around literally just page seven, and people would open the door, walk into the shop, and then just leave, and because it was ultimate geek hangout, and we enjoyed it. And then we left London and we went to Lincoln. And that's when I started my college courses and met up with the rest of the various crews in terms of Rick Priestley, John Stallard, who were working out at Citadel at the time. And it didn't take long for me to then start painting for Brian. And in those days, I could paint up a whole load of his orcs, and then I got paid in castings. So I popped round to Newark, to the amazing location, ex-Victorian sort of sweatshop that was, and enjoy literally just handing over the miniatures to Brian and then saying, he says, right, there you go, that's your credit note, off you go. And you'd go out into the shop floor and you'd see them blistering, and you'd see these rows and rows on the floor of just boxes of lead. But they were just you're just like, oh, little kid in a toy shop. And, I used to come home with a rucksack and get on Newark and go to Lincoln on the train with a rucksack full of lead, just going, "Ah!" And from there, chats to Brian, I started sculpting, and also some illustration. I think I did some for one of the Warhammer books that was produced at that time. And it was just great fun. It was when Rick and Tony Ackland were also at the small little bungalow that was such a dense small room, and I think John Blance had just joined them as well there. So at that point in time, we were just, again, I was hanging out, living the dream. Finished my college course, and that was a base foundation course, and then went on to do graphic design. And literally, as the moment that I graduated, then I went over to Eastwood, which is where they were at that point in time, and started to help Joanne out in doing the graphics and paste up, and didn't stop. I think at that point was just totally consumed. And this is in the days when everything was, spray mount, scalpel blades, going into a camera room to make camera ready artwork for hours a day in horrific conditions to a certain degree, just because of the heat that those things kicked out. But it was a sense of brand new horizons. It was, there was definitely that encapsulated sense of something was being created, and Warhammer and just the whole industry in general was, it was at its birthing stages before it really sort of just blew up, and from there it just kept on growing to the degree that we needed our own space for the design studio. We needed to migrate out of Newark, not Newark, sorry, Chewton Street, sorry, and we went and found. I think they wanted it for the sales team, which was an interesting expansion. And we went and we found with the studio manager at that time. We went and found Low Pavement. I remember walking around with him when it was completely and utterly empty, and there was nothing in it, and just marveling at how much space we were going to have available to be able to, to draft in paste up artists, to actually get a camera room, to have space for Tony to actually display his arcane collection of books. It was a great time. And all through that time period, we were just 24/7 to a certain degree, balls to the wall working. It wasn't a job in that sense. It wasn't being employed. It was you were just so passionate about the products that you were developing, and the time disappeared. It really did become wonderful fun. Absolutely, just it didn't feel like you were working. It felt like you were literally involved in a wonderful creative process.
Sure.
And it's not until recently, I think, with the work that you've done and the nostalgia that's been evident, the Talking Miniatures book that Robin and John put out, that I've been able to read through those perspectives and form a totally different opinion on that sort of period of time, and actually look back on it now and think about just how broad a group of people came together in such a symbiosis and such a shared drive, that it's remarkable. I think that to see just how it came about, and all fundamentally down to to Brian at that time, Brian's vision and his direction, and it was I don't think I've ever in any of my latter employment environments found a similar sense of creativity, a similar sense of anything is possible.
Hmm,
And we just have to literally, grasp the nettle and do it. And in a lot of cases in those environments, did we know what we were doing? No. Did we find out as we went along? Absolutely. But it didn't stop us. It didn't impede us. It wasn't something that concerned us from that perspective.
sure. I mean, how did that creativity sort of manifest on a day-to-day basis? Were people just coming up with new ideas and doing their own things, or sort of what was the sort of the almost the vibe and the feel of a regular day?
Well, it was dependent upon which floor of the design studio you were actually on. The top floor that had the paste up artists, the camera room, had Tony, production managers, the typesetters, and so forth. And so that was pretty much usually a hive of grindstone activity with lots actually ongoing just to get through that production process, so actually get product out the door as swiftly as possible. But then if you went downstairs into the other layer where it was more the writers and the editors and White Dwarf and the miniature designers, then it was much more open in terms of well, how about this? How about that? Or you'd see someone come in from Eastwood and say, "Okay, this is the latest castings." Put them down on Rick's desk and say, "Right, stats and background. By the end of the day, please." And we just everyone would just go, "Look at this mini. It's and the creative juices would be worked that way, and it was wonderful.
Hmm,
Um, but of course, at the same time, you had to avoid the Perry twins because they usually would be running around the floor if they were in. And then they'd like practical jokes. So every now and again, you'd just be walking down and they jump out. And you just be like, oh God, okay. That was like crossing into a different zone when you went into the design studio side of things. Much more, much more art based, much more artistic, much more creative, but equally, it's focused. You went in to that design studio environment, and you could see each of the designers' desks. You could see what was being developed, but you could also see the array of different tools that each one used for different processes, for different parts. Um, to and so the whole day-to-day activity, because I used to have to pretty much walk around all of these areas, gathering information, gathering perspective before putting together, like an article for White Dwarf, or just the layout, just finding out what was actually going to be and what was available. Because in the early days as well, I did all the photography, so I remember taking the first Pantone sheet of graduated blue and using it as a backdrop in the days when you had to have such huge spotlights to be able to actually light the miniatures.
hmm.
That in the days when we started to actually get the slaughter bases in, we had to get metal ones made and paint them black because they melt under the lights, and so yeah, it was a lot of running around, getting content, putting it together, coming up with something, and then handing off a graphic design to our conceptualizer, Mark. He'd come up with a final design. We'd sign that off, and then it went out to the paste up guys. And so it was perpetual and great fun.
And you were working on, so you worked on White Dwarf during that period, right? And but you also were working on the design and layout for some really major releases for GW. So that I'm right in saying that you were working on Warhammer Fantasy Battle Third Edition, Rogue Trader, the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. So I mean, what was it like pulling together and being part of the team to produce those kinds of books?
It was a lot of work, but again, it didn't feel like work. So, it was all about creating a final product and trying to create within the time we had available the best that you possibly could that could come out of the design studio. I mean, we were pretty proud of the quality and the quantity of work that we would put out. Um, there was quite a few, I think, frustrations with the process, just in the fact that it took us time to actually coordinate and to actually upgrade and constantly improve and take it from the typeset word processing ball typewriter that they had at Newark to fonts that we were allowed to actually purchase so that we could typeset, so that we didn't have to hand lay out with Letraset. So it was incredible. I think, and I don't think there's any other process that was as productive in the career-wise, just because everyone was more motivated by the creativity than they were necessarily by any other motivation. We were just enjoying what we did, and it was remarkable. I mean, even when we started to absorb and accept the relocation of workload from Games Workshop down in London, when they started to hand over projects to us. So I think the Best of White Dwarf 3 was the first one I worked on and started that layout and getting paste up and getting structures done. And then with Superpower, the board game, again, that was the first one to really come through the design studio. And from then on, every single one of those major projects and board game, and more importantly, the monthly publication of White Dwarf were the pressure cooker of perpetual motion, and it was wonderful.
Sure, yeah.
It really, really was. I mean, to see new art come in that John had commissioned, I can't remember days where it captured that similar feeling. I mean, when the Peter Jones artwork came in for us to take a look at for the Warlock of Firetop Mountain board game, and we were just kind of like blown away that we were having this opportunity to be working with these major commercial artists at that point in time, and creating that kind of product that was commemorating the fighting fantasy. So it was just brilliant.
Yeah,
absolute brilliant fun. And couldn't have improved in that sense, other than if there was hot and cold running caffeine or this was in the days when you could you'd pop out at lunchtime to the local pub and a couple of pints of Theakston's Old Peculiar, and then come back in all excited again, recharge, and jump straight back into the fray, as it were. So it was good times.
Okay. I mean, from a sort of what was the mechanical process like for creating those games and creating those books? So you sort of talked about a few elements of it with the sort of photography and the lighting, paste up, and that sort of stuff. But to someone who hasn't been involved or seen those processes, what was the actual sort of almost step by step of creating, say, Warhammer 3rd edition?
It all started, I think, with the drafts that Rick would produce, and he would then, this was in the days, I think it was Amiga word processors that everyone had, and you would actually get that disc would then come up to be typeset, and you would then get galleys of typeset cassette rolls and rolls and rolls. So there'd be a trolley that would come out of the typesetting department with what looked like sort of ancient script rolls on it, and it would be, you know, half a chapter or a chapter of a book, and then that would go down to Rick, and I think then he would take it home and it would be edited, and it would come back with corrections, and then those corrections would be updated, and a new galley then would be put out. And once that was signed off, once the editorial content was approved, at the same time, art would have been commissioned to accompany that, or we would wait until in the latter days, certainly in 40K, we would actually have pasted up proofs. So I would have taken photocopies of the galleys, cut them, and left spaces for illustrations to illustrate specific points, either examples of play or specific lore points would have been designated and said, okay, this is a double page spread that we want for this, or this is, you know, a quarter page that we want for that. And then those photocopies, as it were, of the layouts would go off to John and off to various other people for checking and approval and so forth. And once they would be approved and back, and the paste up crew would take over, and they would literally assemble those components from the galleys, cut out the specific words, cut out the artwork. If artwork came in that needed halftone screening, they'd disappear into the camera room for half an hour, 20 minutes, however long it took to take the photographs, that they would then, again, create camera-ready artwork that once it was signed off and approved, would then be sent to a repro house for them to turn into negatives for plates. And from the plates, you would then be printing, onto the various substrates, whether it was a book or a board or a wrap or a blister card or White Dwarf or the monthly mail order catalog, the sheet that had to go out. So it was a defined, structured process. But it was also a lot of chaotic fun, and this is in the days before a lot of health and safety would have put restrictions in. So if you walked past the paste up artists, they had draftsman's boards, big A0 draftsman's boards that they'd be working all day. Then the floor around them was just about, I don't know, 3-4 mil in thick, sticky, spray mount overspray, or cow gum if they wanted to actually use that. So it was, you definitely knew that you were walking past the paste up stations as you progressed up, and it was brilliantly laid out. You had the two offices that were the boss's offices. Then you had the camera room, and just in front of the camera room, because he was the master of the camera and perfectly understood exactly what was required in terms of grey screen and dot gain and exposure, was Tony Ackland. And he had his huge backdrop and of books, probably 300-400 art reference books that he had there, that we spent more time reading those and looking at those, and he always be sat there working away. But he had a wonderful fixture that was part of the Wastes of Ackland, as we called it, and he had this probably about the size of a breakfast bowl, but it was an ashtray, but it was about yay high in just detritus, and it used to smolder, and just strange sort of exotic symbols used to come out of it. It was just brilliant, and this was 3-4 feet away from someone with an open can of spray man. Different world in terms of that perspective. But it was hilarious. It really was.
Yeah. You were working on, so you did the graphic design for Rogue Trader, so you helped sort of shape the look and feel, I guess, of the sort of visual identity of the book itself and how all the art and sort of the text was brought together? I mean, do you recall any of your sort of the conversations you were having about the approach to take and sort of the journey that you went on with that book?
I think it was. I think it was primarily redressing or reapproaching what a war game book should be in terms of making it easy to use, so that the chapters were broken out, the way of finding the pages numbers, that they were listed on the side, so that when you were flicking through and doing a referencing, you would actually be able to access and track and move quicker. Was much more of an information presentation from a graphical interface perspective than it was necessarily just let's make a great looking book. It had a dual use of ensuring that if a consumer picked it up and wanted to play the game, then the immersion process of reading from page 1 through to the basic rules through whatever was sequenced, structured, and understandable, clear, and encapsulated what we felt was the sort of like the grimdark aspect of the world setting and the environment. And so it was, I think, perhaps different than relaying out third edition or some of the others, because it was a brand new intellectual property from that perspective. And a lot of the look and feel of I did all the diagrams, all of the maps, the initial logo design. I did some additional background work with Rick. So it was, again, it wasn't just, it was like every creative bone in my body was invested as part of the process. And that sort of focus of bringing all of that together, Rick's writing and all of the team, just then putting it into a final layout as an interface for the people to use. It was just tremendous fun, but it was also unique. It was also, something that we hadn't necessarily seen before, but has been replicated certainly. But it was novel. It was new, and I think that we were lucky to have probably an illustration budget and an illustration layout amount that preceded, a lot of the books that you see now, where there has to be a certain illustration density, there has to be a certain, you can't have page and page of text. There has to be. It's much more of a hybrid of a graphic novel, of a allowing the consumer to immerse themselves into that world setting, into that environment, making sure that there's a photo showing a game in play, making sure that there's photo illustrating an example, so that you never fundamentally forget that its engine was to drive miniature cells, but at the same token, it was also to engage and to actively draw people into this new and wonderful grim setting. But no, it was different. I painted. I remember doing the first demo and painting up the minis that Bob Naismith created at that point in time, which were the limited edition Para ones, and the Eldar with the Hoover guns before they actually made any of the original first run Rogue Trader Warhammer 40k figures, and painting those up and doing a demo at Dragon Meet or Games Day, one of the two, so it was the first time that and you there is the person who's putting some of this together. You actually got to see the look on people's faces when they took their first mission and played with their first Space Marine and got introduced to the lore and everything. And it was we were lucky, I think, and I certainly feel lucky to have been able, not necessarily to have been pigeonholed in that sense in these days. And you go into a working environment and it's right, that's your responsibility. That's it. That's where your involvement in this particular project starts and finishes. And in that studio environment, that at that point in time wasn't true. There was open discussion and open and active creation.
Yeah, I mean, because those books, Fantasy Battle, Third Edition, Rogue Trader, they are quite an advancement from the previous editions of Warhammer. Was there anything like them in the sort of marketplace at the time, or did it feel really super new across the board? Was everything that was happening in those books quite new and innovative?
I think it was quite new. I think that there hadn't really been something that kind of user interface, to use the computer games industry terms in these days. There hadn't necessarily been something that provided that sense of immersion, that sense of active. There was a lot of products out at the time, role-playing products, obviously being around for a while, and they were still struggling to to produce books that had illustration density of more than 10 or 15%, primarily because of time constraints or budgetary constraints. And so, let alone having, 2 pages of color in the middle section of the book, it was still embryonic. It was still just starting as an industry. And so, a lot of the production value was, what you would expect from a sort of a garage or a smaller operation. And as that grew and expanded, then the production value could be increased. And I think that rather than say this is the market expectation and let's meet it, there was definitely a thought of let's put a unique stamp on it. Let's make the customer aware of the intellectual property on a page by page basis, so that it's not just reading. Your brain is actively involved either through illustration or through photography or through article or miniature painting or how to assemble or all aspects of the hobby were integrated into the book, and I think that probably was a first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they seem, looking back now, obviously, I imagine at the time they seem like a real step forward into sort of changing the nature of the hobby, and like you say, how people accessed it and sort of the journey they would then take in learning about the game and the world. There's quite a lot to that, and it's easy to forget that these were new things. We've now seen so many editions and so many versions of them. But at the time, they were quite new things.
They were. It was. Yeah, that was another part of the excitement, was the fact that it afforded us an opportunity to do something unusual, to do something that made a difference in the market. I mean, at that point in time, we were doing localized UK English language versions of various role-playing games from the States. So Call of Cthulhu, RuneQuest. We'd actually get the various bits of artwork sent over from the States and then have to resize it or relay it out because of the difference between US paper size and UK A4. So that there was a lot of opportunity to see what other manufacturers were doing in certainly the role-playing industry side of things in terms of the book production, and look at that and go, well, that's nice, but how about let's see if we can do this. And I think it was just serendipity. We just didn't know any different. We didn't necessarily feel constrained or because of ignorance, and we wanted to do and did as much as we possibly could, and we squeezed, I think, every erg of energy into every second that we were in the studio, which I think I'm repeating myself now, but it didn't feel like a job in that sense, and I think that made it unique. So it was, it was of its time. And I think that as the the brand and the company grew and expanded and concentrated on its current infrastructure, then that changed. And I think a lot of that freedom to create has been not reduced, but has been narrowed down to what the law and what the rules and there's a structure there now that constrains. Whereas from our perspective, it was like that's a brilliant idea. Let get it in there, get it in there, get it in. And it was that was again was fun.
Yeah. Do you remember any of the inspirations that went into the actual logo design for Rogue Trader?
Well, there was Jez's eagle, obviously, but I mean he'd come up with that independently. The typeface, we wanted a serif font. The Warhammer 40k or the 40k section underneath was kind of an afterthought to a certain degree. So it was, and I think at the time we commissioned it out to one of the guys that was doing the airbrush design. I'd done, I think I just didn't have the time, but I'd done the caverns set and a lot of the dungeon floor plans, the actual airbrushing the logo and doing the full color paintworks. So we'd established with those, we kind of established a sort of like that crusty metallic, but it didn't look brand new. It didn't look like it was super chromed and fresh. It looked like it had been through War is Hell, and it had that sort of visceral feel to it. And we wanted to keep have a degree of change from what we'd been doing with the Stonehenge font, which was the fundamental font that Citadel had, and just about everything at some point was used. Yeah, even though we didn't have a letraset sheet of it, so we didn't have the ability to write it down. So we had one sheet that we had to photocopy or PMT, literally make it of, and then either hand draw it or just cut and paste it. So I mean, it was photocopies of a. It was blurry, and it had its own sort of essential grimness to it, primarily just because it was being photocopied to death. But again, it was. It was part of that make, do, and mend, and part of that improvise, and part of that just create. And it was part of that whole project, I think, of getting not only the Warhammer logo and the 40k, but also all of the additional content that we had in there, the little quote boxes. They shall know no fear, and chapter approved, all of those things that gave it a sense of officialdom. It gave it a sense of additional background, all those little graphic tweaks that I think added to that overall sense of looking at a form in front of you and thinking, okay, well, yeah, that is a request from the higher up, so I better do something about that. All of that sort of figured into it, and the majority of those were based upon the graphics and sketches that Chaz was working on at that particular time, and it just all gathered in. There's a lot of the graphics that we did, certainly the diagrams and the weapons and those that were inspired by the graphics that I did for Chainsaw Warrior.
Sure.
So I did all the cards. I think Chainsaw Warrior was another one of the ones that was a freelance job. So it was a weekend job. Don't do it in studio time, do it off the books, as it were. Here's a freelance payment for you. And so a lot of the card design, that interface, and the way it looked and felt with different bits and pieces transferred into the look and feel of the diagrams of the Imperium, which was it was progression, and it was nice to see that it kept on growing. But I think the first thing that we did with 40K is we produced the insert that went into White Dwarf. And I think it
Right.
was a 4-page or an 8-page insert that was included and just stapled in that provided a brief visual summation of what the product was actually going to be like. And it was from that initial task that the look and feel and the structure kind of grew and came out of that, so that you got the sensation that you were viewing the information through the eyes of the Imperium, through the eyes of a Space Marine gathering the data. And again, I think that was probably novel at that point in time, just to give it that look and feel. But we kind of done it to a degree on Rogue Trooper and some of the other licensed products where we learned to that if you were trying to teach someone how to play the game, then speaking to them in the IP language and saying you are you're the last survivor of the Sol massacre and therefore blah blah blah, that it helped immersion, it helped you to actually get engaged and to become part and parcel. So I think that those experiences with the board games and the other products that came through added into that sort of gestalt of wanting to produce something that was fully immersive, that you could really get into, and that had that depth of world that these days you go to a computer games company and they talk about intellectual property creation, they talk about here's get the creative Bible structured, and here's the land, and there's this whole entire process now that's kind of structured and is set in stone for the majority of creative processes. But at that point in time, it wasn't, and being part of that process was just tremendous, absolutely tremendous.
Yeah, I
Just
mean, it sounds like a very organic evolution, and a lot of all those sort of lessons learned across a number of different products and a number of different artists all sort of coming together to that culmination, that sort of end point almost. Obviously not the end point, but it was almost the that first peak, maybe.
yeah, I think it was just pure chance to a certain degree. I mean, the fact that Rick, Brian, Citadel, all of those things were nascent. They and D&D coming in and a new market for toy soldiers emerging out of that expendable income of your 14, 15-year-old, generally male, different now, I understand, but at that point in time. And it was nascent. It was unprecedented, and it just grew. It grew from laser burn or production values of we've got enough money to do 40 photocopies and staple them and hand assemble them, and it just progressed. And I think that we were lucky in that perspective.
Mm. Yeah, an important point in time. It feels like, obviously, the beginning of a sort of major shift. Obviously, it was a lot leading up to that and a lot of amazing work leading up to it. And then that kind of was where things were consolidated and the next chapter began almost.
I think it was the first opportunity that we'd had as Games Workshop Citadel Miniatures to actually to have the access to and the funding to be able to produce the kind of quality products that we wanted to. Like I said in the past, it was what was affordable and what was obtainable. And so when it got to a point where you could increase that production value, you could commission a raft of artwork rather than be restricted to a budget of only 2 or 3 pieces, then it made a significant difference to the final product. And I think because at that point in time you didn't necessarily, we didn't have a production manager who was a specialist in book production. We didn't have a production manager who was a specialist in board game production. We just had enthusiastic people who were doing the best they could at that particular point in time. And as that financial momentum grew, then the quality of what we were able to produce grew. But it was always underwritten by a fundamental drive to produce that quality, to do the best we could within the time we had available.
Hmm.
Although I do recall and recollect many a time when there would be a knock on the back of my head and say, "Have you finished those layouts yet? Have you finished those layouts yet?" And we're going, well, oh, it's another all-nighter then tonight just to get this done. But
Was it a similar sort of process and feeling when you were working on the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay?
no, what Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was slightly less, I think, less. It had less of, not necessarily a budget, but I think time,
Mm.
bandwidth dedicated to it, because it wasn't necessarily at that point in time. It was an unknown in the sense of what its financial sales potential was going to be, and so therefore the amount of bandwidth that the studio was allowed to dedicate it to it was lessened. But it was equally as much fun. I was part of the playtesting group. We would sit in the boardroom, and pizza would be brought in, and we'd playtest out the latest particular structure and rules. And so again, as a layout artist, a graphic designer, being able to then look at the careers paths and think about, well, okay, how do we lay this out and lay that out and lay that out and not make it repetitive, not make it too cookie cutter, as the Americans say. Then again, there were things that we could do in that. I did the maps, some of the diagrams, so it was immersive from that perspective. But I don't think that it quite reached the level that we have with Warhammer Third Edition, and then we have with 40K, because it was just different. The folks that were working on it and working on it from a role play perspective were different. And I think that at that point in time, role play, whilst it was obviously with D&D and the other variants that had come out, was an effective and it was good turnover. There was good sales potential. It was unknown, so it was a little different, but we still integrated the IP. We still got an opportunity to expand on lore, and so there was a lot going on that was a great deal of fun. I mean, I don't think necessarily the foundation of the intellectual property would be the same as it is today if it hadn't been for the amount of time and effort and creativity that was put into role play. And I played a dwarf character.
Right.
And I think I rolled up, I can't even remember what class it was, but I rolled up that my belongings that I actually got in start off was a bag of clothes peg and a mule. And that was I was just like, okay, as a dwarf fighter, what am I going to do with a bag of clothes peg and a mule? But it was a great part of that system that you actually you got that, and then you moved on and moved into that world, into that creepy, watch your back. There's a Skaven lurking around every corner environment, and it was much better.
Yeah. Was it different again working on the sort of boxed games as well? So you mentioned Chainsaw Warrior, but then you were also involved in the Fury of Dracula and Blood Bowl as well. What was that like as opposed to the sort of the core war game creation?
They were equally as invested, I think, but they were more manic, and they were certainly a higher schedule in terms of there was this one, this one, this one, this one. This is what we have planned. There was Kings and things. And again, it was a mixture of homegrown product that we would create, and also we would bring in Cosmic Encounter and do a new version. John would be doing the board artwork and the card artwork at the same time as he would also be spraying up a new background to use in photography. So it was uh, definitely spinning plates in that sense. But it was also just tremendous fun because you got to play the games. So Kings and Queens came in, or Warrior Knights when that came in. So again, it didn't feel like work because you were just saying, okay, well, if I'm a new player and I open this box up, how do I make sure that the rules are under clear, that they're understandable, that graphically, that you sequence the way in which you've packaged that product, so in such a way that you pop it open and first thing that you see is the first thing you want the consumer to see. So it's the read me now, this is the quick start rules, or this is the summation of what this game is about. That's an expansion on what was on the back cover of the actual product. So to me, it was simply a different kind of vehicle. Its constraints were different, but what it was selling in terms of suspension of disbelief was equitable. And certainly for things like Dread, and I still have my copy of issue 1 and issue 2 of 2000 AD, original, bagged and signed by all the artists in it. So we were geek central. All of us were American comic and British comic, and just heavily invested in that emerging marketplace. And so each of those products, when the chance came along, to commission, say, Chris Achilleos to do a Judge Anderson cover for the companion was just dream. I mean, it was absolute dream environment, and you couldn't get any better in that sense. But the board games were abbreviated as well. I think more than anything, they were. There was a certain cost of goods that they had to maintain. There was a certain amount of print that you were allowed. So it also forced you to constrain how many words, how many examples of play, and it helped edit those down. And a lot of them were done as freelance projects. For instance, Chaos Marauders, which is one of my personal favorites from that period of time, just because I love playing a sneaky git on an opponent's battle line. That was done. Steve, myself, and John Blanche did that all out of house, layout, the graphics, everything, and just delivered final pasted up copies and to the studio head and said, "There you go." And it was almost as if that was the weekend's work would also be shoehorned into that. And perhaps one of the best moments of my career was later on. I was working for Wizards of the Coast, and I was the creative director of Magic, and I got to meet up with Richard Garfield in the R&D building, and he turned around and he says, "You do realize that Chaos Marauders was one of the games that heavily influenced him into creating Magic the Gathering, because the interplay between you and your opponent, the ability to actually play cards and to change your opponent's status and environment, was an intrinsic part of Magic." And so that was just, that felt like a great career moment in that sense of going like, wow, okay, I can't believe it, the game that we produced. And it was I think a derivative game that was French, that was based upon American Indian canoes in the original French England Indian wars. And so you would build your canoe and then you would have to sail it, etc. So it was great also to see that there's, from a games perspective, that there's always a history, there's always a genesis trail of types of games and where they've come from. So it was that as an intrinsic part of actually just working in the games industry in and of itself is wonderful fun.
Yeah, that's terrific. Yeah, and you didn't just do the sort of graphic design and that sort of stuff at Citadel. You also did some sculpting as well whilst you were there, and
I did.
created
Yeah.
the Chaos Snakemen and as a sort of a range. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how you transitioned into sculpting and then sort of what you did in that space?
Yeah, I started before I even came across and started the graphic design at Eastwood. I started to do some sculpting for Games Workshop, primarily because Brian said, "Yeah, give it a shot, see what you do." And I started out doing treasure piles and dungeon furniture and graves and gravestones. And so, there's quite a few out there that have a whole load of just things hidden on them. So I'd make a table and, it would just have usual knife, fork, whatever. But underneath it, there'd be a Cthulhu-like tentacle coming out because that was, that's what you'd expect in the old world. And so I did those and they went well. They sold. I actually got royalties on them. So I had a royalty check from Citadel Miniatures for graveyard accessories and stuff. To me, it was a progression, but I didn't, I was focused on the daytime job was literally doing the graphics. And so the sculpting was an aside at night. And so, when I first brought some miniatures in to show Brian, he turned around to me and he said, "Well, you made them in milliput, which we can't mold because we need them to be flexible. So here's some green stuff." And at that point in time, it was rocking horse poo. It was rarer than gold. And so trying to actually learn how to sculpt with this bubble gum in contrast to a clay it took some time, and it wasn't until later on that I felt confident enough to be able to say, "Well, okay, Brian, check this out and see that this is what I've had a go at." And there was no at that point in time, I'd come up with some degree of background for the Chaos Snakemen, but there was no, it wasn't an intrinsic part of the range. It wasn't thought of in any way, shape, or form. But I let Brian have a look at the minis, and he seemed cool with it, and so they went ahead and went out. And then after that, I think I did the Chaos battering ram in the monstrous arcane wonders,
Arcane
whatever.
monstrosities, I think.
Arcane monstrosity.
Yeah.
Digging deep into history here. And that was basically my version of Grond from Lord of the Rings. Prior to there was films or whatever, it was just I wanted that on the battlefield to be able to field that, and smack through the mighty fortress defenses, and it didn't seem like it was a fixed commission or whatever. It was just that's what my brain came up with at the time, and I'm grateful that it actually made it into the molds and out into lead and out into the marketplace. But I'd been hanging out with Brian, and Rick and others Asgard days when they were actually over there in Lace Market, and so we'd known each other from that perspective, and he'd certainly been aware of the fact that I wanted to sculpt, and I was interested in sculpting, and so it was just a natural weekend progression, as it were. I'd like to have done more, but again, that would have eaten into what 40K became. So it was great, and I got chances, many chances later on in my career to be able to do, things that I wouldn't necessarily have imagined. Like again at Wizards of the Coast, I was working with on getting the miniatures license for the Star Wars role-playing game, and I made a Darth Maul in 3 days, sculpted the original, and we took it down, and it was based upon that interpretation that Lucas basically awarded us the license. So, it's not as if there wasn't opportunities further down the line to then, become more involved. And it's similar with, when Upper Deck got the was it Upper Deck or WizKids? Can't remember. But we did a pitch to Blizzard to get World of Warcraft, and so I sculpted a whole load of prototypes and painted those up that were then an intrinsic part of the proposal and negotiation to acquire the license. So it's one particular string to the bow, as it were, that every now and again I'll get that itching sensation to dive back into, but
Yeah.
at the moment, not at the moment.
Sure. I mean, you went on to work at, I mean, you mentioned just a few there, loads with really important companies in the sort of tabletop space. I mean, I was curious about how it differed at, say, like a Heartbreaker miniatures, like how that would have been a different sort of process or environment to Citadel. Was it quite similar and it was just a different company, or did they
No,
have different ways of doing things?
it was a totally different way of doing things,
Mm.
but it, it was certainly the production and sales process was identical.
Right.
The Bob Watts who ran Heartbreaker was ex Grenadier, and so he'd had all of the experience and from making molds, casting the entire structure. And what he was doing was primarily just getting us to make the masters. So there was myself, Tim Prow, Phil Lewis. And we would literally just be at home working, remote in the days way before COVID. And we'd sculpt, we'd send him the master castings, and he'd pay for them, and that was the process. So it was a pure freelance endeavor, uh, but it was also a, an opportunity. I mean, he Heartbreaker also worked in conjunction with Target Games in Sweden, who at that point in time were creating their own intellectual property, which I think is now mutated into Warzone, which was
So the
the
Mutant Chronicles.
Mutant Chronicles line. Yeah, 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 yeah. So part of the task with Heartbreaker was there was they run into a challenge with some of the plastics for the Siege of the Citadel game. In the fact that this was the old days when the plastics were done three up and three times the size. So I've got metal castings of three ups of orcs and goblins of this size. But we went over to, so they said, well, do you fancy coming over to Stockholm? And I spent 3 weeks in Stockholm, compressing 3 months worth of time making the minis for Siege of the Citadel. That was a great experience. Just again to go into an environment where I had to take into consideration the plastic production methodologies of that time, which meant no overcut, only front and back mold. So it was a restriction that was significantly different to sculpting for a rubber mold for, say, Citadel or for metal production. But again, it was all grist to the mill and all an opportunity to learn. And so, at the same time, we got to hang out in Stockholm, which was an eye-opening education. And I got the opportunity of drinking the Swedish Scottish Malt Whisky Association crew under the table as part of the last night activities before jumping on the plane. So it was, again, it wasn't a job. And it wasn't until much later in the career that it mutated into a job, and it mutated into to a definitive. There's a life balance separation that needs to occur here before you just overinvest and over obsess to a certain degree. And I think that it was good, to be able to actually progress and to learn from that. But Heartbreaker was probably the wildest in terms of freelance days, just because at that point in time I was the artist that they employed. I wasn't necessarily there as a representative, so I got a chance to just be myself, and it's wild and it's wacky and whatever, and it was great.
Yeah.
And learn plastics manufacturing. That's something that we'd seen. I mean, I'd seen the process. I'd seen, Nick and Bibby and the rest of the team sculpting in that horrific Chavant, stinky clay that they had to make the wax clay masters out of. And, I was initially intimidated. But going through that process was, it gave me an insight, and it gave me an opportunity to go, well, okay, I understand that process now. I understand what the restrictions, what the constraints are, so that in the future, when I come into contact with, say, a company that wanted to do a board game and they wanted those miniatures manufactured, I would then know this is the baseline, but this is feasible. If you wanted to pay extra, then you can have a third part of the mold, or a fourth, or a fifth. So it established a foundation that I'm grateful for, uh, just for that opportunity. It's was fairly unique from that perspective. The Heartbreaker days.
Mm. Yeah.
And then it mutated. At the same time, I was doing work for a jeweler who was producing silversmith versions of the little, what are they called? The fantasy creatures that are on Harrod's staircase. So, I was freelance sculpting for her in addition to Heartbreaker, doing, I made a penguin wearing Dr. Martens and a tie as a tie pin master to go to a tie manufacturer's celebration, so that you spent 50 years with the company, you were going to get this shitty pin. But there was just strange stuff. Skateboarding Nun was another one. So there was this, at the same time as I'm doing this stuff for Heartbreaker, there's this strange esoteric run of teddy bears cufflinks that we did that were sold in Harrods. And again, it was an opportunity to investigate and to learn how that production process was actually carried out, from taking my masters, making a lost wax, and then making the various different precious metal versions of it. Just a great deal of fun.
Yeah.
And I was paid. I actually got paid more for the skateboarding Nun and the penguin than I would get for 4 or 5 minis. So it was a good balance to actually have that as a freelancer at that point in time.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you went on to, you mentioned working at Wizards of the Coast as well, and you did a couple of roles there, I think, and including, like you say, directing Magic the Gathering, and also helping to sort of revive Chainmail with Mike McVeigh, I believe.
Yep. Yeah, no, that was part and parcel of the that particular remit. We had an opportunity at that point in time where we were asked as the miniatures team to create something that would be equitable revenue-wise with what Games Workshop were achieving. And so at that point in time, we only heard that, and we didn't necessarily hear the other part of the brief from Peter Axon, which was that it has to be a D&D. It has to be an adjunct to D&D. And so we gathered a team, Mike, McVeigh, I actually interviewed and flew over Kev White to come and miniature for us, but he declined the offer. And so, we had a team there. There was also, oh God, I've forgotten his name. He's going to kill me for it. Matt Wilson, there we go, dug that out. He was the art director on Magic as well, and he was part of the team. And we produced a product and designed a product that was called Magic the Fury. And it was basically taking the Magic intellectual property, but making it a figures game, making it a war game, taking that intellectual structure and just having mass combat within it. So, but we did, to a certain degree, we took that traditional medieval fragment of every kind of mirror of bits of fantasy that Magic was, and we kind of went grimdark with it. So we had, black. We'd already invented the Phyrexians and got those created for the Magic intellectual property. So we went much more, what I would say, dark, Games Workshop, grim, and produced a product. We did a presentation for it. We put it together. We got Chippy and Dave Allsop did the art, and we laid it all out. We did a great presentation. They had Battle Chasers was another comic influence that was in there then that mixed up an anime style. So again, it was a different and we made that pitch, and at that point in time, Peter just went, "No, are you mad? You've got guns in this. You can't have guns in this." And so things changed, and at that point, it mutated into what Chainmail then did become. So, our involvement at that point in time ended with that presentation, sadly, and at that point in time, my responsibility was as a miniature sculptor, and so I would be commissioning sculpts and working with the sculptors, but that was it. And so a lot of the things like the D&D anniversary miniatures that we did and other ranges, Star Wars ranges, that was more what I did as I filtered through that particular part of the design studio. And so Mike and Chris and the others took over that task of creating much more of a chainmail, much more of a reiteration of an adjunct for D&D, which to a certain degree, both myself and Matt felt would never meet the sales goals. And so, it became a situation of changing lanes and moving on to doing something else at that point in time. But it was still, it was still great. I got to work with, at that point in time, there was another sculptor working with Wizards of the Coast called Kim Graham, who worked large, and by large I mean big. She made the dragon that was in the Wizards of the Coast game center. So it was a Shivan dragon that was, I think, 40 foot long.
Wow.
All right, and she made statues of the various iconic characters from Magic the Gathering to go in every one of the Wizards of the Coast retail stores that were opened up. And I helped in terms of creating the sculpting and learning, again, that process of making an armature, in welding it, putting it together, covering it with silver foil to bulk it up, then putting a layer of clay on top, right the way up to making the final mold from which the fiberglass casting would be created. We'd then paint it and then box it, ship it out to the retail unit. So again, it was a totally different process structure, but also a great educational opportunity, and doing that improved my sculpting significantly because it was at a different scale, and it was a different mentality. But in the end, I think that what was perhaps the most telling aspect of that particular story was that Matt Wilson then went on to create Privateer Press. And and I want to be clear, 100% Matt who created it. But the seeds for the game, and I think the seeds for the look and feel of what we were trying to arrive at, came out of that Magic the Fury presentation of that game, the concept of what we wanted to produce. So all credit to him for basically, at that point in time, becoming one of, I think, the third largest manufacturer in the industry, and certainly standing the test of time from a longevity perspective. So again, it was interesting to see how that divergence also grew.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah, I mean, it's because obviously you've worked across a number of different companies across different sort of aspects of the tabletop industry over the years and over the course of your career. I wonder if you've got any sort of perspective on how things have changed since those early days at Citadel to where it is now. I mean, what sort of evolution have you seen across the industry, do you think?
I think the biggest evolution has become that it's become a process with structure and role and responsibility. We were flying by the seat of our pants. It was a night raid over Dusseldorf when we were out there, and but now it's very much, here's a project manager, here's a schedule, here's this section, this section, this section. You've got this amount of time to come up with the initial draft. You've got this amount of time, and it's become far more what we would expect as a job. So that, from someone coming into it, it's become a profession. It's become a professional environment with, standard structures that realistically is no different than any other consumer product development process. Whether it would be in toy and games or whether it would be in, confectionery or whatever, it's become standard practice to do this, and this in this particular structure, rather than, Brian coming in and saying, well, chaos. It's all about chaos. Let's do this. And that germ just swept through the studio like a huge fire. And that, I think, is lost. I think that now there's a lot of professional account managers who will come in and say, okay, great, now looking at this particular product line, this is a particular intellectual property, we need to maintain this income structure and we need to maintain this profit margin. Therefore, this is the products that we can expand upon, or the products that we can do in order to maintain that cash flow. So there's become a degree of top-down requirement within the profession that stifled the creativity a little bit, I think, or at least restricted it to a way in which it was, structured and therefore perhaps less chaotic, therefore less of a risk for a lot of people. Certainly, from Games Workshop's term, I think that was a valid concern at that point in time. But in other jobs, I think it's very similar. That there's a lot of professionality that's actually been introduced, and professional requirements that expand on and grow what you would need to work within the industry. And I think I was fortunate enough to have that great foundation in Games Workshop, where there was that creativity, that was that investment, there was that drive to create that product, to be able to then transfer that into different environments and different business working environments, but still have that fundamental consumer-driven, this is what I would want if I was, if I'm going to be playing RuneQuest, then yeah, I want a dark miniature, absolutely. And I think that's that a lot of people coming into the industry now only come into a fractional pigeonhole, only come into a very small box, if as an art director or as a law writer or whatever. And so that opportunity to learn across those myriad of different jobs, as it were, has been drastically reduced, which I think is sad to a degree, and it more turns it into a profession than it was your hobby that you were dedicated and passionate about. Still there, it's just that is the significant difference, because it's become a significant turnover. It's become, instead of the hundreds of thousands, or it's become hundreds of millions. And so, it's at that point in time, a degree of maturity does have to creep into the process in order for that, that situation to engender longevity, to engender brand equity, to engender, a loyalty that's actually going to ensure that, when someone gets, say, burnt out of a particular intellectual property or a particular game interface, whether it was Magic, whether it's 40K, then at least that they're not getting out and hating that particular product. They've gone through that journey, and more than likely their sons or other parts of their family are coming in, and it's become almost a father-son or a relationship structure to those games. Magic was very much like that. You actually saw that. Well, one of the reasons for its success was that it allowed a younger consumer and a broader demographic of consumers to interface one with each other. And it was that social interaction that was crucial to its success. So I think that and the internet and the availability of things now has made a significant difference. If you take a look at, say, for instance, the number of board games being kickstarted, or the number of fifth edition settings being kickstarted, or role-playing game settings, in contrast to those time periods where it would be great if you got 20, 30 products out a year, including the publications, to now that's almost a daily total of new product coming into the marketplace, which it means it's a full marketplace, and it means that it's targeting just about every single niche potentially out there, but it also means that it's grown. And so there's a fundamental part of that sense of commercialization that's occurred, and that sense of, to a degree, exploitation, because we are fueling to a certain degree people's need. We are providing escapism, and we're doing so for a fee. And so there was parts of me on occasion that would think, is what we're doing, by producing this business-led now consumer product, is that something I'm happy with? It's something that I'm feeling good about. And I'd always turn around and offset that negativity with the positivity of saying, well, everyone out there, when they're playing that game and they disappear for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and they're in that world setting, they're in that environment, irrespective of what the vehicle is, board game, card game, computer game, novel, fiction, then that joy, that sense of escapism, that sense of happiness that those people get, is offsets that, well, was I being paid to maximize and consider just how much we could squeeze from this particular market. And I think that it was later on in the Kickstarter era when that became more and more a concern, in terms of taking people's money before you actually got the product 100% ready, and it became much more of a risk investment than it did necessarily a provision of product to consumers. And so that was an interesting shift in the marketplace.
Do you think that that's, you mentioned, like, the corporatization in the bigger players that's kind of leading to less risk, but then maybe the increase in the proliferation of the sort of Kickstarters and the indie titles is sort of where the risk has now gone, almost, in terms of creativity. Does that sound
think
fair?
so, yeah. I think it's also a bit of a gold rush in the fact that everyone can see that there is finance to be made on Kickstarter. They can see that direct-to-consumer model works, and works unexpectedly better than a lot of people anticipated. I worked with Monolith Games when they did Conan, and they were anticipating sales of 500,000. Yeah, that was their peak mark. And the actual total when it launched and it went into the millions, it just freaked them out, because they just weren't ready internally with infrastructure and management. They weren't 100% ready to deal with that huge potential. And I think that the early days of Kickstarter allowed for that risk. They allowed for consumers to participate in that creative endeavor. I think that's still there, but I think that it's now simply become yet another sales vehicle. I think a lot of that sense of not necessarily the hype that I think was part of the exploitation, but that original, oh my God, they're making a board game of that. Oh, I've got to buy into that. Absolutely. And because there was no triple tier distribution, it wasn't a manufacturer selling to a distributor selling to a retailer before it ended up in the consumer's hands, the margin that was involved for the manufacturer of it was just gravy. I mean, it was a huge in contrast to that. And so they could afford to produce products that would never have seen the light of day if it hadn't, if it had gone through that triple tier distribution infrastructure. And so the consumers were getting a products that were, to a certain degree, false expectation, in the sense of that they were getting a great deal, no doubts about it, and it was a great improvement in that model. But it wasn't necessarily indicative of the rest of the industry sales methodologies. And in order, and I think it started to eat itself in that manufacturers got a license, wanted a board game, and then in order to escalate, or in order to get market share, they had to then say, well, okay, for my $40 in this initial set, you're going to get this and this and this and this and this. And it became almost like a marketplace where you were vying for the consumer's spend rather than producing a product that was going to actually deliver. And we've seen the various ups and downs of the different companies who have not well planned and not well anticipated the shifts and changes in the world of manufacturing, and how that's ended up killing a few Kickstarter companies and leaving a lot of money a lot of the backers' money on the table, sadly. So I went through a great learning curve with Monolith with their products. We did Conan and then Batman, and then at the same and Mythic Battles, and then from there, onto Mythic Games, Joan of Arc, and their various products. So it was again a great opportunity to be involved in that process, to be involved in a direct-to-consumer interface, communication, marketing, sales structure. But at the same token, that there was that, that sense of, is this stable?
Mm.
And so I was quite happy, I think, to have got to the point with Mythic where I just decided to move on rather than be invested any further in that particular situation. And
Sure.
it was, I think, beneficial.
Yeah.
But again, it was great educational opportunity to be involved from that ground floor environment into that explosion sales of Kickstarters, and certainly, in terms of CV building for new opportunities. And then, having gone through that process, having run campaigns and gone through those 14, 15, 30 days of where you don't sleep and you're constantly on forums, you're constantly communicating, you constantly update, then again, that was a different set of skills that were required. But it's...
Sorry.
It's just a different sales methodology, and it's interesting to see that it has stabilized to a degree. But again, it's more just the big players that have settled down. So you've got your Simons and Awakened Realms, and then you've got a swath of others who are expressing that creativity, who are taking that risk. And I think that's great to see, because I think that stagnation to a certain degree has occurred in some of the larger companies.
Do you think that that's the sort of model for the foreseeable future, or do you think something new could come? We just don't even know what it might be yet, but we'll see another evolution in time.
I think we'll see another evolution in time, and I think that it won't be that long. Perhaps in the next 4 to 5 years, there'll be another direct-to-consumer crowdfunding shift. Whether or not it's pre-order, or whether or not it's a different kind of payment infrastructure so that the actual amount that you have to pledge is, significantly reduced. Just the way in which it changes, I think it's going to be interesting. As is the development of content creation and artwork creation by AI, and the impact that that's going to have, and already has had, on Kickstarter projects where people or manufacturers have little remorse or little feeling that there's anything wrong with creating a product, both in terms of content and in terms of artwork, using purely AI tools that are currently available. And so it will see what market response is to that, whether or not there's sufficient negative market response in terms of actual bottom line sales. In a lot of cases, there's been a lot of negative PR, a lot of negative press, comments boards, and so forth. But in terms of the actual hard numbers at the end of the day, the impact is minimal. So I anticipate that we will see perhaps a shift to either incorporating AI in some way, shape, or form into the product development process and being transparent about it, and being fundamentally honest about the situation. And I think that there is a degree of it that to some is acceptable and to others isn't. But until there's a compensation fund set up for all of those artists from whom the various AI software scraped the internet and soaked up all of that in order to give it that baseline that it can use, until that is actually sorted out between the major companies, I think that there's a fundamental legal and a fundamental moral question about engaging that into any part of the actual product development process. But we'll see. There's a lot of manufacturers out there now who their entire prototyping infrastructure is all AI art, because it's immediate, and it's cost effective, and so it's embryonic of change. That's what I feel at the present moment in time.
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting era that we're walking into now, isn't it?
Yeah, but and it's totally addictive. I've got accounts with every single one of the AI generation software programs.
Right.
My chill out time sometimes is just to go and write prompts and just to watch it come up with stuff and go, I've never expected that. Never expected that. Don't do anything with them, but again, it's that instantaneous gratuity of just creating like that. It's addictive, and it does put a sort of a perspective and a moral pressure on you. But it's also, as an artist and a creator, it's also, you can see that there are aspects of it as a tool. So I think there's a lot of potential, but also there's a lot that needs to be ratified before it's accepted by the general psychographic of the games industry. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that, in the broader, wider world, AI is probably be accepted. There'll probably be AI video adverts running on TikTok right now that no one will give two hoots about. But with the board gaming world, the role-playing world, that particular psychographic, then, the moral bankruptcy that they accuse those manufacturers of, I think still has relevance, and it does give pause for thought.
Yeah, indeed. It does. I think it's a vexed question that I think you're right. We'll see how people respond and how the market responds to it as it sort of evolves. But have you got anything fun that you're working on at the moment, and sort of any projects or any sort of exciting stuff that you would want to share with us or are able to share with us?
No, I have several. The one that's top of the list at the present moment in time is an opportunity to work again with Tim Pollard and Drew Williams at Satire Studios, where I'm getting to pull together some additional content in terms of scenarios and books and so forth. So I'm doing graphics and layout and diagrams and whatever, so that producing more of a nostalgia product, so more of something that has an investment in it, that has less production value, more of a pastiche of adding to that. So in talking about the sort of period of time where there was Macbeth, there was everything scenario where base was generated in order to sell minis.
Mm.
But it was a fun part of that time. There'd always be an advert that would go out in White Dwarf, whatever, for the battle bid deal, and so if you got a huge 50% discount off if you got this, and that was an intrinsic part, I think, of Workshop's success in that early stage of just having that consumer direct mail order structure. And so, yeah, no, I'm looking forward to that, and hoping maybe I'll do some sculpting for them as well. But we'll see. The other one is much more up to date. It's much more based on Kickstarter experience with a young French company called This Is a Game, and they have several different projects that are in the pipeline. From role-playing game set in 15th century France, where folk horror, pagan is big on the list, which is just stunning. And there's a couple of twists in there that really make it interesting. Then they're also doing board games, and there's one that they're working on that is a mixture of a card game, a board game, a dexterity game, and a miniatures game. So it's a hybrid of all of those all into one in a competitive environment. And they also have negotiations in place with several anime products, which is interesting because it ties into the time where at school I was doing the Dragon Ball Z collectible card game, and so I know a lot of the Japanese manga and animes, and it's another part of that global phenomenon of fantasy or of escapism that it's great to be involved in. So I'm looking forward certainly to those activities over the next couple of years, I think.
Terrific. No, that's great. Yeah, really, really exciting stuff. That sounds amazing. Like the complexity of how some of those different mechanics and sort of approaches are going to work together sounds like it'd be really interesting to see how that
yeah,
plays
no,
out.
it's great. We get regular play test updates, and there's it's a wonderful creation process because it's a smaller company, because it's everyone has an appreciation of the entire process, cradle to grave. Then and because it's an open structure in the sense that there's no hierarchy and that we can all contribute, it just makes for the final end product is just a synthesis, and it is iterated to as good as we can get it in that time frame. And the fundamental drive of the company is that it's fun. And that's still that childlike innocence in me that recognizes that value in being able to switch off, tune out, forget about the global craziness that's going on, and just say, yeah, for the next 40 minutes, I'm an orc. Wow!
Which is what it's all about, really, isn't it? It's great.
It is. That and on occasion, I get to wear the helmet.
Great stuff. Well, I really appreciate you finding the time, Chaz, to chat with me and for sharing those recollections and memories. It's been really fantastic. So thank you.
It's been a great opportunity, and I appreciate you asking.
Thank you so much to Chaz for taking the time to talk to me about an incredible career across the gaming industry and at Games Workshop. It was really fantastic. If you would like to support me and the work I do here on the channel, feel free to check out my Patreon or use my Element Games affiliate links when you buy your hobby supplies. You can find those in the description below. Thank you once again to Chaz. Thank you for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.